So now it's time to answer the most asked question. What is thug life? What does the hate you give actually mean? Now, of course, it refers to this quote from Tupac. The hate you give little children, everybody. And how you interpret this, that differs per person. And if I would give my own interpretation, I would say that I would definitely stick to what the book says, and that the hate you give children, so the input you give these children, that influences the rest of their lives. So if you give these children, as an example, hate and crime and drugs, they will end up in the same system. And I think that's also what both Maverick and Khalil explain as the hate you give, what it stands for. So what is actually meant with the hate that these children experience? Well, first of all, it's the environment in which they grow up. They live in Garden Heights, a very poor society filled with violence, filled with crime, filled with gang members. And that influences the lives of these children. And some of them even end up selling drugs themselves, like Khalil. They end up as gang members, they end up as king lords or as garden disciples. They end up walking around with guns, which is what we definitely read in On the Come Up. So that's something that's a nice crossover here as well. Now Maverick makes it kind of bigger, and he also explains that it's also related to the American prison system, where black people are punished more severely than white people. And we can say that it happened here as well, because 115 does not get indicted, he doesn't get punished for what he did, but Khalil does with his death. And we could also say that the hate these children get is the fact that they remain poor. They're born poor and they will remain poor for the rest of their lives. They can't get out of Garden Heights. So whatever happens, they will probably end up the same as the previous generation, and that generation would ended up the same as the previous generation before them. So that's also kind of the system in which these people live. Now it's interesting that on the one side, Maverick definitely wants to say, I'm going to save these people, and he does this with Devante. He wants to give Devante an option, he wants to give him a job and an opportunity to make something out of his life. But on the other hand, he also feels that Uncle Carlos, who got out of the system, who made something out of his life and who now lives in the suburbs, is kind of like he kind of betrayed his own roots. And he betrayed his heritage by moving out of the garden. And, in the end, Maverick also decides to move out of the garden and give his children a better life, because Lisa has finally convinced him that he can help the society from outside Garden Heights. And I think that's a nice way to kind of end the system for these children. Now, another example is Khalil. He's an example of the hate you give that ends up in the poor way, because he himself ended up selling drugs. His mother was a drug addict, and he ended up selling drugs to help his family, to help his grandmother who got cancer, so she can't work anymore. He's dependent on King. He needs to sell those drugs. He ends up dead. So eventually he gets screwed over by everything because he chose the wrong path to find a solution and to find a way to get out of this system. So Khalil is also one of those examples of the hate you give, of thug life, if you like. So basically, thug life stands for the idea that the lack of opportunities and the negative influence that these young people in Garden Heights are exposed to will eventually lead to them ending in the same situation as the generation that they don't actually want to be. Again, I'm going to make a crossover to the sequel. This is definitely something we see in On the Come Up, where drugs play a very important role throughout this story. And I think it's a very nice link to the hate you give, that everything we see in On the Come Up is kind of obvious based on what we know from the hate you give. So this is definitely a book that I would recommend you to read after reading The Hate You Give.